Well, hello and welcome to Guardians of M365 Governance, Episode 7. We've been going. It's a steady clip here. So, hey, Ragnar. Hey, Joy.
Hello.
Hey, wonderful to see you.
So this Techie Guru series is a monthly webcast focused on the rapidly evolving and expanding Microsoft 365 governance story. Our goal is to share insights, best practices, and the latest information about new governance features and capabilities within Microsoft 365. And so because this live stream is dedicated to everything, anything governance within the Microsoft ecosystem, if you have questions or comments or thoughts about what we should cover or guests we should have on the show, if you think you should be on the show, please comment, let us know. For this episode, it's also important here, Ragnar, there's something different here. We welcome our new permanent co-host, Joy Apple, who's a
wonderful news. Exactly.
Former guest on the show, was just so good. Had to have her back permanently.
Yeah.
Make her do some work.
Best conversion of the whole year.
Yep.
Moving guests into permanent
Welcome,
host.
Joy.
Oh, thank you. Thrilled to be here. I'm sure you two gents as well question at times, where in your career did you take the left turn where you found governance exciting and something you wanted to talk about? But here we are, and I'm very thrilled to be here.
Yeah. It's funny going back and thinking of that. You know how I'm sure both of you have had similar conversations where you're talking to people about your role. Remember, I had different titles as I moved to different companies and had moved up each time and made more money and had expanded role and all of that. And people like, wow, you've really just done different things. I'm like, no, it's all pretty different titles, pretty much the same things.
Mm-hmm.
You're also talking about my life because I left Rancor like 15 days ago and in my new company, which is called Hansevision, part of the Bechtle Group. I'm still busy here with governance topics. So
yeah.
A lot of news. On the other side, I'm going to be consistent in one of my favorite topics.
I think back to a project I did on the government side of the world, just helping them elevate folder structures up so backup and recovery could actually find the content. I didn't know that was governance.
Well, that's like my first experience with governance was on kind of the IT governance side. And I've talked about a lot. I built a project management organization for a company, but to set up the review, the governing body that was looking at all the various projects, that portfolio view, establishing the process, the standards, making sure that we were following all of our industry standards, the compliance rules, all the security measures for that. And I was working in the data warehousing world. And so very strict policies around whether people could get access to some of these raised floor environments, for example, and understanding kind of the rules and doing the adoption of rolling out new tools and going through kind of all those so that we were creating data and accessing the data in the right way that was building the experience for everybody. And we weren't, every time we go in to run reports to pull out insights from the data, we weren't messing with the data, doing it in an organized way. So yeah, it's fun to go back and look at that, have that historical perspective of what brought us here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's another one of the big names in governance is here with us today. We'll just add him in now. So Mr. Richard Harbridge. Hey, Richard.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Richard, for those folks that don't know you, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a chief technology officer of a company called Tutorlead that does a lot of governance and technology strategy and helping customers implement various Microsoft 365 technologies. And then before that, I've had a storied career from the SharePoint days on to the Microsoft 365 ones and now Copilot era. And it's been at Microsoft in the field. I've written some books on governance. It's been a topic of passion for mine. So I love that you guys are guarding, the success of governance. And I'm really excited for today's discussion.
Well, I'd love to jump into it. And because as we were talking about before we started recording, like we're all about the drama here. So when you think of war stories, when you think of going out in the field, talking with clients about governance, I mean, I know we all have this. I'm asking this to, I'm preaching to the choir here that there are themes, there are patterns with behaviors with clients. We often don't get surprised by things that clients are doing or not doing. It's the same things. But what are some of what are some of your experiences there? What are some of the things that you talk about with clients the most often around governance when that comes up?
So every customer has governance debt, right? Even us, like none of us feel like, oh yeah, we got it. We got everything covered, right? Like it's always there. It's always prevalent. And the issue becomes, do we perceive it as risk mitigation? And so, hey, we can pay off that debt when it becomes, too risky and we have to address it. Or do we, address it earlier because we want to drive better efficiency, effectiveness, things like that? And so I think the main idea generally that a lot of times is the horror is you come into customers who are kind of at the last mile anyways. They've got some major change like AI, like Copilot rollout, and they're like, hey, we need to fix this governance problem. And it's a harder time than if you kind of did incremental steps, from the beginning. This idea of just getting people together in a room and saying, hey, operationally, how can we make this better? They'll come out with things that become, governance documents, policies, things like that. But you got to get those people together in the first place. And unfortunately, that's often left way too late in the flow. And my favorite example of this, and it's almost always every customer, the first thing we do is we say, okay, well, let's at least look at your service settings. Like, let's just go through, the settings configuration. What is it, Gartner this year, right? 60% of organizations see preventing things like cloud misconfiguration as their number one priority, right? Like compared to, I think it was 25% in 2021. Why is that? Because of Copilot, because this, driver for actually resolving some of this debt. And so, every time we do this exercise, and some of these customers are quite mature, they've been around for a long time, they have great teams. Yet when we go through the settings, their settings are like, we don't know what that is. And we're like, how do you, this setting's been there for 3 years. It's there for a reason. It was demanded by customers. It has these features. The default often is off or it's on in a bad way, that thing like, guest links, what's it called? The shared with everyone type links where it's like everyone in the org, right? Those are defaults that you can change per site. So a lot of it becomes this educational uplift, even if we're not changing every setting, where it's like, oh yeah, we haven't had this discussion. And, the longer you wait, the more that builds up, right? What was 2 recent announcements? Org messages, and there's this really cool purview thing where it's like AI risk usage, like risky user usage, and it's like a compliance thing that says, hey, there's like someone trying to use Copilot in a way that suggests that they might be trying to grab data that they shouldn't be getting. So like those 2 simple examples, org messages, like how the heck do we use them, and that very different, but 2 examples of things that customers may not even know exist, right? So I think the most horror stories come from a place of, we look at it as risk mitigation, which means we'll do it later, instead of seeing it as efficiency, tactically, how do we do things better? And if we thought more about governance as that executor for success, then I think more people would just kind of regularly look at it as they look at the rest of the Microsoft stack and figure out how to take better advantage of it. So yeah, so that's where the frustration and also the challenge definitely comes in.
That would also mean that we have to talk more about the zero trust topic for insiders, or the internal risk, or the insider risk management, because usually we talk about zero trust against cyber threats from outside, but now it's more getting deeper into the risk insider part, because sometimes companies have, they just have to audit and to log what prompts people are using, and then also monitoring prompts which are not wanted and expected and are corporate style.
I like that you mentioned several times, have a conversation, talk, discuss, especially if, let's say I'm used to being able to go and share with anyone or anyone in the organization, and suddenly that goes away. As someone that may not have been part of that conversation, but is this broken? So am I going to put in a ticket to the help desk because now I can't do it? Wait, you're changing the way I worked, and I'm probably going to be irritated if I have to jump through more hoops, right?
Not even irritated. You'll work around it, right? You'll roll up Google Drive or Box or something.
That's where every shadow IT effort started, was
every time.
I don't understand this. And sometimes it's not even that you're not given the capability. Like, it's just new. You don't know how to do the thing. So you go around it with what you know.
To do your job, right? It's
Right.
not to be malicious. It's
Yeah.
like, I need to do this. But if we have that conversation, discuss it, and we see, well, this is safer, it's more secure, it's better for the company, it's better for the employees to do it this way. Sure, it's going to be different. It's going to be slow the first couple of times we do it because it's different, but there's a value and there's a reason behind it. Most of the times, employees, we're going to go, oh, okay, that makes sense. Talk, discuss, advise, socialize. It's so
You
important.
can kind of see the pattern too, right? So you get, I know a lot of people talk about it like Wild West over here, and then highly controlled, super top down over here.
Yeah.
And the thing is it's not. It's like a matrix. But anyways, first of all, that analogy is terrible. But even if we use that example, the problem is you see both sides. So you got that side that has never paid any debt, right? And they haven't done anything for risk mitigation, and they have to start figuring out rules and plans and plays and playbooks and teams and structures, because that helps everyone be more successful. Just like a football team who didn't have an offensive line, defensive line playbooks, they're not going to, you have the best talent in the world, they're not going to perform, right, if you don't have some of those structures. Yet on the far side of it, I see way too many organizations, way too many, where they've gotten so risk adverse that they've locked everything down, and the value discussion is terrible, and they've lost trust, and it's much harder now to corral people back towards effective use, right? Because they've on many cases either throttled or limited it so much that people can't do what they should be able to do. And I think there's again, almost always that extreme risk or not is both based on education. And both sides, what's happening is there's a gap of understanding that, hey, there's a very responsible, very effective way you can do this, while also giving people more, pathways for escalation or pathways through, and so on and so forth. So I think that's you guys hit the nail on the head. That's the big challenge, right? And I feel like most of the time we're more like therapists or education specialists as we go in to talk about governance than we are, really like going in and configuring things and solving very particular issues.
Well, you've got to be careful too. It's funny that you went the therapist route. That was the comment I was going to make. It's like, we can't be like the come in, sit down, no, lay back on this. Tell me about how your mother looked at governance. Like, no.
How does it
like
make you feel?
Right. No, you can't do that. And a lot of people look at it that way. It makes me think, it reminds me of like the whole early on information architecture, the whole metadata description. If you put all of the burden on every user of the system to do all of that, what's the result? They're not going to do any of those things. It's like too much work to do. I just need to get my work done. And so the whole concept of like, you need to have governance, but most of it has to be invisible. That's why I love the phrase, the term guardrails. Put the guardrails, do the hard work up front.
Yeah.
And as much as you can put into the guardrails, and do that up front so that people work within those guardrails. It's the bumper, the lane bumpers for bowling that you put them up. You're going to hit the balls at the end 99% of the time. There's like, one of my kids will always find that spot right at the end between nothing and the pins and hit right there. But most of the time you'll hit something. But that's why I love the whole idea of go in and have the conversations like you do with you talk about. Go in with the clients. What are your policies? Let's reset these. Here's why. What are the policies to set up? Do the pre-provisioning of. You're going to create a team. You're going to create a site. Have them pre-built that meet your standards. I'm a huge advocate, and I don't know what you guys are seeing out there for like open, no approval necessary, create whatever you need. What, like create a team, create a site, create a list, create a plan, or like whatever those things, if the guardrails are in place.
There's a term called like whitelisting, right? Where you kind of pre-approve. I think that the general idea is whatever you do has to add value, even if it's like security stuff, right? And it's hard to wrap your head around it, but there's always a way to present it that way. So let's take the provisioning, the parable, the biggest one right, for governance. When you provision, if we're automating and templating, tailoring it, creating drip campaigns for proactive adoption, we're doing all these positive things, which we can do because we know things like which department it relates to, which product does it relate to. Is this the first type of site you've ever created, right? Are you the first time owner, right? There's so many of these signals that we can gather, and we can just make transparent why, as they're filling out, say, a form to request a site or a space, like make that transparent. Like, this is why we're doing this. This is what you're going to get on the other end of it. And if you don't, and a great example of this is if you don't use like digital workplace directories, you don't use experiences that use that metadata and all that information they're providing you, then you are, quite frankly, just using it for IT's benefit. And that's not the right way to approach governance. My favorite thing to highlight here is also the trigger conditions. So a lot of times we think of like, back in the day, we'd have upgrades, upgrade, right? And there'd be a major transition and we'd think of governance again. And now in the cloud, I think what's interesting is I see a lot of organizations, with Copilot going, we finally need to rethink our Microsoft 365 service model, right? Like what is this service? What's in it? And right now, most of those organizations go, it's Exchange, it's SharePoint, it's Teams, right? It's Office. And you're like, no, you have Planner in there you're using. You have, all these different apps and experiences. And there's a lot of these things not at all represented in any of their governance, in any of their strategy, configuration planning. None of that is represented. Power Platform is another great example. It's kind of been off to the side. Maybe it's part of the Azure team or whatever. And it's like, no, it's Microsoft 365. Like, where is that data stored? It's stored in many cases in Microsoft 365. If we're talking about Teams, Power Apps, et cetera. So it becomes this discussion of, just like before, it's been a while. Have you thought about like how you're using these tools? And in almost every instance, they're using tools that have no governance at all. No one has an idea how they're managing Planner, what provisioning, what lifecycle, any of the typical questions we'd ask about any of these workloads. And so, yes, it's great that Copilot is paying that tax, and helping us cover this debt. But really, it should be a wake-up call to say, hey, probably like, if not quarterly, at least semi-annually, like twice a year. Sorry, I don't know if that's the right way to say that. Biannually, whatever the right term is. We should be checking, right? We should be saying, like, what are the services we're using that are new?
That's a very nice thought, Richard, because Christian also mentioned the word of guardrails. And when I usually talk about governance and guardrails, I think about the security. Let's take bowling. If you have guardrails, then you cannot hurt somebody on the other lane. But guardrails can also have a different effect. They can keep the motivation, especially when you have young children. They're more motivated in bowling when you have guardrails. And here I think the value of M365 model work would be to invest more into governance to keep up the motivation very, very high, because the massive amount of tools you just mentioned, Richard, can be overwhelming. Rolling out every single tool, Loop, Power Platform, completely can be overwhelming. And then people are just losing their interest and the motivation in the modern workplace. So that's another value what governance can add to the whole game.
Governance question number one, usually, Richard, I'm curious to see if you've experienced the same, but Brenda in accounting, she doesn't know if she needs a team. Should she just use OneDrive? What about SharePoint? It's like that first when to use what question can be intimidating. And to your point, if you have that templated process, Brenda knows what she needs to do and who she needs to be working with to get it done. Maybe not. Should it be a team, a SharePoint, just my OneDrive, whatever. But if you give her a button that says, do you need to do this accounting thing? Click here.
Yeah. And sometimes it's more subtle, right? So the Brenda example, when you create something in the wrong place, which we all do, you need to have movement. You have to have mobility. We have to have a pathway for support, either programmatically optimally, so you don't even have IT directly involved, so that they can learn how to do copy, move, et cetera. There's a lot of functions, capabilities in the platform that people don't know how it works. And that particular example is a great one because it happens all the time with videos. I'm sure you guys have seen this, right? People record a session, like an ad hoc meeting like this on Teams. It's stored in their OneDrive. They don't realize it's stored in their OneDrive. And because, later they either find out or it becomes an issue because someone's trying to access it and they can't share it easily, it becomes like, oh, you have to move it or you have to copy it or you have to do these actions. And if you don't copy it, you lose all that transcript. There's a lot of rich metadata that you lose. So there's a gap in education, but more importantly, mobility, right? Where we know these patterns are going to come up. To your point, Ragnar, like these amazing little bumper rails. Like we know these are going to come up. Let's like make extra effort to make it really visible and easy to understand. Like this is a common scenario, and here's how you address it. And I'm a big fan of using the tools. So in organizations of like 200 or 100 plus people, we use Viva Engage, what used to be called Yammer, this Q&A capability, and it's quite robust. And so we're finding more and more, we're just adding those types of questions into that space. And then as people ask questions, we encourage them, or we ourselves as governance experts, maybe answering the questions, we post them into that space, and then they become, relevant for future, right? The next time another type of scenario comes up.
Yep.
And this creates the most important part of governance, that living, breathing element of constant guidance. It becomes more adaptive based on the organization as new technologies roll out. So I think sometimes we also think of, I have this policy. It's in the policy. Look, page 216 in the policy. If you go, there's a little sentence. Well, it's buried in the sentence, but if you expand this little section, there's a little section that explains this, and it's like, no, just put it in a more accessible place like Q&A, or make it more visible in all your training. Next time you're talking about recording meetings and making meetings better, just make sure you highlight, hey, a very common thing that happens when you have meetings is you have to copy this, and then people go, wait, I didn't know that feature existed, and they start to realize they can use it for OneDrive for files, and so on and so forth. So digital excellence is everyone's responsibility, but it's a cost center that almost always hits IT. And if IT has to pay for both governance and digital excellence, then it needs to be IT's priority to be able to show visibly to the org, hey, this is where investing in digital excellence is actually reducing, our support requests and things like that.
I think part of the problem is, because I know, governance is such a big word, as you were talking about, hey, a lot of these are training issues around it. Here's a great example of, I think that perfectly captures this is when people go, we're used to in exchange, I go in, I create a meeting, I invite the three of you into it. It's a team meeting. It's then the recording is captured in my OneDrive. That scenario is the community management aspect of that. The training part of that is to help understand, hey, this is our ongoing project, which we're managing the day-to-day activities and conversations in teams. This should be a channel meeting. Yeah. So then nothing has to be moved. And so part of governance is the community management, in that you need to redirect people, say, hey, look, there's a slightly different way to go and use the tools. I'm not beating you up in here, but this is a recurring meeting around the project. It should be over here. And what that does is automatically the recording, the notes, the dialogue around that, the attachments, everything, it's in Teams. I'm not having to move it from my personal OneDrive over to have these assets. Everybody that needs access has access. And that's something that is part of community management. And I think all of us have done some degree of community management on one of these tools or multiples that are out there. That's part of it. It's a redirect rather than a scolding. No, you're doing it wrong. Must do this way, or not allowing them, and they're trying to do their work. I can't seem to do it. Get it right. Because the things are too restrictive, overly restrictive. No, you redirect people in there. That's how. I think how small children, how you teach them to do something. They're doing something. They're sticking their finger in the plug in their wall. You don't go and scream at them and slap their hand. It's like, no, you redirect them away to something that's going to get their interest until they're able to understand, like, hey, that's bad. You could get hurt by doing that.
Don't do that.
Come take a look at this, look at this shiny thing.
And then you put those little plugs in so they can't do it.
Right.
That's right.
But
the guardrail.
Oh, yeah, the guardrail. The friction, though, this is what I see. The friction is there's a lot of IT, and I understand, you have a cost center, right? There's a lot of IT that says, well, governance is risk mitigation, right? Mm-hmm. And if governance and adoption are the same thing, if we think about it, like I said earlier, this is about effectiveness, it's about efficiency, all those things, then you're good. This isn't going to happen. This is great. This is, a handshake. But if there's not, then there's this friction point, because then they say, well, this isn't our responsibility. It's, people in development, learning, HR, whatever, somebody else. And because that happens, that's where you see a lot of the issues. And so it brings up this big question, which is where does governance sit? How should it be structured in an organization? And, this is becoming much more of a problem now with AI, because of course, AI is much more business led, which it should be across an organization. And, as the business creates new demands there, IT has to kind of catch up. So I have a couple ideas there, but I think that's really the hardest part of that discussion is, it's the right pattern, but I find there are not a few, there's quite a few IT departments who are overworked, overburdened, and they need to find the right places to draw a line. And so they'll draw the line on things like that. And that really increases their cost of ownership later, right? Because we all understand those implications. So, I'd be curious of what you guys have found worked well for that, because, sometimes we'll use like little narratives, just sharing the total load. So if you use Box, okay, go use Box. But at the end of the year, when you're in that CFO meeting, IT should be saying, hey, we of course had to look at Box. We need to do these types of assessments. We need to prepare and do some test migrations. We need to do all this stuff to make sure that we're able to move it, solve these issues later. And so this is the cost that incurred. It's not, charged back to that group, but it should be visible that there was a consequence to those decisions, right? So there's tactics like that, premiums, whatever you want to describe them, that IT can do to increase funding and enable some of that pathway support from, the executive body. But I was curious, what you guys have seen in that space.
So when selling governance tools, one of the biggest takeaways was that customers are not longer asking for fancy reports and dashboards. They really want automations. So the tools should really help them, which means making work easier, saving time, not forgetting things, but really going deep into automations, delete things, archive things, change permissions, whatever, or maybe track something in the third-party ITSM system, but they should do actions. So that's very important. Customers expect that these tools are going to save time.
And yet one of the questions that I hear the most at these events, I mean, Copilot, I know, is kind of drowned out a lot of other dialogue, but was around, we started hearing a lot in the last year around Power Platform governance. Like, how do I properly keep track of who's building what? Are they being used? Are they accessing the right data for those? Is what was developed scalable? We all love that at that department level. Is it something that can truly move to, I mean, you get it kind of into the, the ALM space of some of these solutions, these advanced solutions, and they're not being properly managed. So then it goes back to, again, it's, we want our end users to be as productive as possible and efficient. And I think with a lot of the solutions, and even Microsoft said this, like, flatten the permission structure. I know we all have our extensive SharePoint N-level folder structure and permissions and all of that lockdown systems. Like, we get all that. And Microsoft really, after they acquired Yammer, now Viva Engage, got into the idea of this flattened permission structure, which I think we've all bought into, and let metadata drive search versus this structure and kind of all those different things. But from a governance standpoint, I think a lot of organizations just kind of threw up their hands and said, we'll let anybody do whatever they want. And now they're going back and they're saying the level of sprawl and what should we be doing there? It's just gotten out of hand. And I'm thankful for the Copilot movement, just because it has woken up a lot of those organizations to say, we can't continue the way that we've been doing this. We need to clean this up. Otherwise, we're going to have, back to the risk mitigation, we're going to have major breaches.
Well, it's like the Delve debacle of 20 whatever year that was, right?
I love
when
conversations around Delve.
Oh my gosh, like, whoa, it's not giving people access to things, it's exposing the access they already had. Turn it off or fix your permissions. Now we're not going to do that. Just turn off.
Go back to the obscurity, security through obscurity.
Don't worry, you'll pay for it in 2024 when Copilot comes along.
I don't see any problems here, people. Like, what do we?
Right?
I think,
everything is fine with the blinders.
There's sort of two layers to this, though, right? So the first one, and I think you highlighted it nicely with provisioning and sites and all that. One of the challenges is, like, today, back in that hierarchy model, we had metadata. We had, like, what was its top, what was it above that? Like, you think of that hierarchy, that was a bunch of metadata, and that gave us context. Mm-hmm. And so when many people flattened, they never kept that metadata. They never, like, defined, because it's not in the system, which is really annoying, right? Like, you need either a third party or you need like a custom list. You need something where you track like, okay, this is this department, this is this product, etc. And if you have that, then you have a pretty good idea of what's in your corpus, those sites, the spaces. And if you have that, you really don't have what we call unmanaged sprawl. If you know what's in there, you have managed sprawl, right? You may not manage it well, but you at least know what's there. I think the secondary scenario that comes up a lot is this issue of like, what's good enough? And I think that really does have, even in I'm sure this group, we probably have different ideas of what's good enough, right? So, I'm leaning more and more, do a lot of Copilot work. One of the things I'm leaning more and more towards is, the security problem of like securing sites and spaces and things. Sure, there's a small subset of spaces you should be over the top, just restricted access control or use a third party and just like lock it down, just force it. It's a good moment in time with AI. We can have better reporting and we can put a bit of friction there, but only for like a targeted subset of sites. The rest of it, I think the bigger risk is around things like labels. It's around this idea of you create a piece of content, you create new content from it using AI. This problem is an exponential increase in volume, variety, and velocity. And those things mean that it's harder and harder to if this was the original iteration point for sensitivity, we've now lost that cascade. And that I think is a fair, because that is much more expensive later to solve, right? Because you have to like go work your way backwards to relabel all these things. So I think like baseline labels, sensitivity labels, DLP, whatever the right arrangement is for an organization, that's a very fair thing that should delay or defer a major rollout of Copilot, should be solved, right? That's a technical debt issue that should be resolved. I think a lot of this security, and I'm probably a little bit more on the far side, even in my own team on this, I think we over worry about some of the security. Once those core spaces are secured, and we've taken that heavy-handed approach, the rest of it is the same issue that's always been there, and we can keep working at it as we have. And maybe now it'll be a little bit easier because there'll be more signals and ways in which, we can automate or improve that. To your point, Ragnar, the actionability increases, right? So I think like that's kind of how we've taken it, because I see so many migration projects, let's say, where we have all this rich metadata and then we lose it the second we're done the project because we never keep it, and maintain it after. Well, this is a wake-up call. We need to do that. And then two, the same issue, we have these containers we move everything into. We don't really know if they're secure the right way because let's be honest, most migrations projects are lift and shift, let's go, go, go. We M&A, you name it. So you get that content in.
Well,
and then
AI will just fix that over the top, right? We'll just put AI in the front of it. It'll fix all.
Yeah, exactly. So like there's always going to be, you'll never have confidence and security to that level, at least identity security, sure, but like not at the content level. And I think the trick there is like, what's that middle ground look like for every organization? That's different acceptable criteria. But then there's some areas like labels or whatever, like just gotta solve that, like bare minimum stuff, because otherwise you're going to be out of compliance and hit with pretty big fines or big risks for data leaks and things like that.
Well, I know that we've in the couple of minutes we have left. Any final questions? Any burning questions?
I have a burning question.
Yeah, Joy, go for
I have a burning question because this is a war story. So, Richard, I know we all do, but Richard, I'm most curious about yours. When we say governance war story, I know you've probably got one that comes to mind. Now,
that gave you PTSD. Yes.
Right. Yes. Why? What's the reason? We all have the reasons why, as SharePoint people, we drink SharePoint. So what is the war story? Please protect the names of the maybe not so innocent, but I would love to know.
Have you guys ever seen either follow the new series or the the games? And this is War Never Changes. Yeah, like they all kind of have the same thing, but there's this one particular organization. I won't name who. It's a very large organization, and they have a decentralized model. So like every facility at the time had an IT manager, had an HR manager. Finance was at least being consolidated, but everything else, they had like a GM, was all structured. And then you had that same thing, and then you had regions, and then you had each of those regions represented a group. And then each of those groups then represented sort of a big division. And then you'd have, so there's like 5 levels of structure, and every one of them had SharePoint service. So this is the largest I've ever had. We had 56 SharePoint farms at the time that we found. That's not all of them. Yeah. We found many more later. And then we had to like both figure out consolidation. There was hybrid, there's Microsoft 365. Like, how do we get there? There's a whole lot of layers to this. And yet governance wasn't as simple as saying, okay, this is the right way to do it. We had to like work with each of those groups to get their buy-in. And so like scalability of your governance tactics was like super critical. And so it was by far the most exhaustive experience because, you know, instead of like one governance challenge, you have, you know, times the number of fragmented structures there. But because we had to focus so much, we had like no money, it's manufacturing, so no money. You had to focus on really, really like proactive, programmatic, low-cost models of how we scaled it. And that felt really good because, you know, after a year and a bit, we had transitioned, I think we down to 12 farms and like a bunch of stuff because there's migrations, so all sorts of stuff happening that also had a governance play. But I always think of, you know, it felt good that the complexity and the mess was better. Now, it's funny because that same customer very recently we were doing some AI stuff with, and I look and I see a different set of new challenges, right? So like war never changes, governance never changes. But, you know, so this particular moment, it's kind of tough to remember that as fondly as I did, but it felt, you know, for the effort that we did, like everything had value, and it kept coming back down to whatever we were doing. We kept having this thing because we had to prove the value. We had to show like financially, like dollars, how it saved money or like helped us make more money. And so that was a really good pressure to ensure whatever we were doing for governance had like a clear outcome, actionability, as Ragnar said. So that's probably my favorite one. And I need more time to explain some of the nuances there, but yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. That's that 56 separate farms. Now I can remember in 2009, maybe 2010, someone brought me a server that had been sitting under somebody's desk. And I was like, why are you bringing this to me? I just do SharePoint. They're like, we think it's running SharePoint. I'm like, okay. WSS, because somebody wanted SharePoint. I'm like, you know, we've got this whole intranet called SharePoint. You know, it's just fun
Remember,
things.
we forget too, that's how SharePoint grew as fast and as widely as it did. It was the shadow IT solution for years, where people would, you know, the IT, the company was doing one thing, and somebody would go and install WSS, an early version of it, on a server on a box under their desk.
If you want a teaser of what the current state is and why it's stressful, is there are shadow tenants now. So there are tenants that have been created by certain divisions now. Instead of one or two tenants, they have other tenants that need to be consolidated now. So that's where we're having. Why did we find that out? Because
all
AI
you need is a credit card,
connect
right?
all the data. You know, it's a good reminder.
I mean, we knew that. To clarify that, that's how we helped better articulate it for Microsoft to be aware of it.
True.
We all saw that. In fact, I'll say that a few years back at the MVP summit, like there were angry voices at Microsoft, like trying to get them to understand the multi-tenant problem that their solutions were not addressing. Yeah. And they've tried to catch
it's definitely gotten better for sure.
Yes, it has gotten better.
It is.
It's not perfect.
Now it's my time to contribute here to the war stories. I worked in the past for Quest Software, and they were strong for building migration tools between tenants. And then once I had a prospect customer conversation that said, listen, we ask everybody on the market. We had so many conversations with Microsoft. Could you please help us to merge tenants? Said, yeah, sure. We're doing tenant migrations every single day. How many tenants you would like to merge? Like one or like two? Like everybody? I don't know, like 100 tenants. I said, what? Yeah, we've got 100 tenants. I said, okay, that's a challenge.
Now, can you imagine the cost savings there?
It's incredible. So this is when governance goes completely wild, completely out of control. So they had such a huge pressure, and nobody could help them. Yeah. Because from the software third-party vendor side, it would be, I don't know, a multi-million project. It would be so it would take so many months, maybe years. It's so expensive, crazy.
You know, maybe everyone should take away from this. Your situation's not that bad. If we were able to survive like multiple Slack, multiple Teams instances, multiple, you name it, complexity, and you've got, you know, yes, a mess, but you know, you don't have some of these issues.
It could be worse, but that doesn't mean you leave it there, because it should also get better. There's always a path forward. And I'll say this, I just had this conversation moments before I jumped over here with a potential customer, just needed to talk about information architecture. So I PDF some of my decks that I use at conferences to present on information architecture. And I was like, if any of this helps, then it was worth it. I said, because I understand you sit at your desk and you say these things day in and day out, and you read the docs.microsoft.com and you share it with your boss and your CTO and your CIO. And then a consultant walks in, says the same thing, and the whole org goes, that's brilliant. Let's do it. It can be difficult and it can be frustrating, but keep at it. Forward our recordings, right? Whatever you can, and reach out to folks like Richard and Ragnar, Christian, myself. We're happy to help. It can get better. And I would say around governance too, nobody reads the 200-page document unless you're the one that wrote it. You're the one that's read it. So it's just, I would say also make sure it's just common sense and actionable.
Maybe we should encourage everyone who sees this video to write their own little, war journal stories, because the more we're all aware of the state of things,
Great idea.
the better
I'm
we
telling
feel
you,
supported,
that's why I keep sharing. There's the
Therapy.
link right there. Come and share your war stories over in that space.
Absolutely.
It's a great
You're
place to
not
ask your
alone.
questions. If you
You're
think
not
you've got a unique problem that we've not addressed, that we've not seen, I'm like, I don't remember the last time somebody's come with a question that we didn't hear about, haven't seen that scenario. We're all using this. It's the same APIs, it's the same tools, it's the same functionality. So there are patterns in the problems that organizations face. Your scenario with with all of the tenants, with the migration. I mean, again, I worked in the migration space for SharePoint. So Ragnar, I've experienced something not that ugly, but pretty close to it. It made me think of the old. In fact, I was just thinking about this last night. I had a conversation with Jared Spataro at Microsoft, and so he, for a couple of years, ran SharePoint, before Teeper came back, and we were talking about Lotus Notes migrations. Have you ever worked, all of you, with a client that was a huge notes company and moving them over?
Not that long ago. Yes.
Right. And a lot of the answers, we're looking for the technical solution. And sometimes in that case where, look, tools, it's so expensive to go and do it. The better answer for that is go and build it the right way over here. And then let those teams, manually move themselves over. Any going in and locking down an environment to say any new team, any new site must be in this new environment. Keep managing this. When you're ready, move your content and things over there. Anyway, it's a more organic process. Sometimes there's just not a technical answer for it.
Sometimes it's just messy because it's people. We're messy.
Governance is messy. It's war. Come on.
Look, sprawl is a natural reaction of adoption, right? Sprawl is a good thing. It's just, is it managed sprawl, even if it's poorly managed, or is it completely unmanaged or unknown? And I think that's the big difference.
Agreed. There's our quote. There's our soundbite. Richard Harbridge. Sprawl's a good thing.
Sprawl's a good thing, and governance never changes.
Right.
Just like that. He had the war face and everything.
Well, Richard, really appreciate you for joining us on this episode. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Ragnar and Joy. Another great episode. For folks that are watching this monthly show, we will be back next month, episode 8. We know who our guests are for the next couple of months. We have Sharon Weaver, who's part of the committee looking at Microsoft 365 maturity model. So we're going to be talking about the maturity model and what she's seen over the years as being part of that small group that runs and drives those community efforts and how you can get involved. And then we have, after that, we have to lock down whether it's September or October, but Melinda Morales, who is the collaboration lead at Dyson in the UK, an American over abroad in the UK, and talking about her experiences and best practices with a global multi-geo organization and owning governance. So it's great. Hope to see everybody at the upcoming episodes, but thanks a lot.
Thanks
for having me.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, everybody.
Like and subscribe and do all those things.
Of course, like and subscribe.
Click all the buttons.
Please.
Bye.